Chapter 20. Under the Regents. The Hooded Hand. Cregan Stark had stepped down as Hand of the King and announced his intention to return to Winterfell, but before he could take his leave of the South he faced a thorny problem. Lord Stark had marched south with a great host, made up in large part of men unwanted and unneeded in the north, whose return would bring great hardship and mayhaps even death for the loved ones they had left behind. Legend and Mushroom tells us that it was Lady Alysanne who suggested an answer. The lands along the Trident were full of widows, she reminded Lord Stark, women, many burdened with young children, who had sent their husbands off to fight with one lord or another, only for them to fall in battle. With winter at hand, strong backs and willing hands would be welcome in many a hearth and home. In the end, more than 1,000 Northmen accompanied Black Aly and her nephew Lord Benjicot when they returned to the Riverlands after the royal wedding. A wolf for every widow, Mushroom japed, he will warm her bed in winter, and gnaw her bones come spring. Yet hundreds of marriages were made at the so-called widow fairs held at Raventry, Riverrun, Stony Sept, the Twins, and Fairmarket. Those Northmen who did not wish to marry instead swore their swords to lords both great and small as guards and men-at-arms. A few, sad to say, did turn to outlawry and medieval ends, but for the most part, Lady Alysanne's matchmaking was a great success. The resettled Northmen not only strengthened the riverlords who welcomed them, particularly House Tully and House Blackwood, but also helped revive and spread the worship of the old gods south of the Neck. Other northerners chose to seek new lives and fortunes across the narrow sea. A few days after Lord Stark stepped down as the King's Hand, Sir Marston Waters returned alone from Lee, whence he had been sent to hire sellswords. He gladly accepted a pardon for his past crimes, and reported that the Triarchy had collapsed. On the point of war, the three daughters were hiring free companies as fast as they could form, at wages he could not hope to match. Many of Lord Cregan's Northmen saw this as an opportunity. Why return to a land gripped by winter to freeze or starve when there was gold to be had across the narrow sea? Not one but two free companies were birthed as a result. The Wolf Pack, commanded by Hallis Hornwood, called Mad Hal, and Timothy Snow, the bastard of Flint's Finger, was made up entirely of Northmen, whilst the Stormbreakers, financed and led by Sir Oscar Tully, included men from every part of Westeros. Even as these adventurers prepared to take their leave of King's Landing, others were arriving from every point of the compass for Prince Aegon's coronation and the royal wedding. From the west came Lady Johanna Lannister and her father, Roland Westerling, Lord of the Crag. From the south, 20 Hightowers from Aldtown, led by Lord Lionel and the redoubtable Lady Samantha, his father's widow. Though forbidden to wed, their passion for one another had become common knowledge by this time, and so great a scandal that the High Septon refused to travel with them, arriving 3 days later in the company of the Lords Redwyn, Costain, and Beesbury. Lady Elenda, the widow of Lord Boros, remained at Storm's End with her infant son, but sent her daughters Cassandra, Ellen, and Floris to represent House Baratheon. Maris, the fourth daughter, had joined the Silent Sisters, Septon Eustace informs us. In Mushroom's account, this was done after her lady mother had her tongue removed, but that grisly detail can be safely discounted. The persistent belief that the Silent Sisters are Tonguelis is no more than a myth. It is piety that keeps the sisters silent, not red-hot pincers. Lady Baratheon's father, Royce Caron, Lord of Nightsong and Marshal of the Marches, escorted the girls to the city, and would remain with them as their guardian. Alan Valerion came ashore as well, and the Manderley brothers returned once more from White Harbor with 100 knights in blue-green cloaks. Even from across the narrow sea they came, from Bravos and Pentos, all three of the daughters, old Volantis. From the Summer Isles appeared 3 tall black princes in feathered cloaks, whose splendor was a wonder to behold. Every inn and stable in King's Landing was soon full, whilst outside the walls a city of tents and pavilions arose for those unable to find accommodations. A great deal of drinking and fornication took place, claims Mushroom, a great deal of prayer and fasting and good works, reports Septon Eustace. The tavern-keepers of the city waxed fat and happy for a time, as did the whores of Flea Bottom, and their sisters in the fine houses along the Street of Silk, though the common people complained about the noise and stink. A desperate, fragile air of forced fellowship hung over King's Landing in the days leading up to the wedding, for many of those crowding cheek by jowl into the city's wine sinks and pot shops had stood upon opposite sides of battlefields a year ago. If only blood can wash out blood, King's Landing was full of the unwashed, says Mushroom. Yet there was less fighting in the streets than most expected, with only 3 men killed. Mayhaps the lords of the realm had finally grown weary of war. With the dragon pit still largely in ruins, the wedding of Prince Aegon and Princess Jaehaera was celebrated out of doors, at the top of Visonya's hill, where towering grandstands were erected so the men and women of the nobility might sit in comfort and enjoy an unobstructed view. The day was cold but sunny, Septon Eustace records. It was the 7th day of the 7th moon of the 131st year after Aegon's conquest, a most auspicious date. The High Septon of Alltown performed the rites himself, and a deafening roar went up from the smallfolk when His High Holiness declared the prince and princess won. Tens of thousands packed the streets cheering Aegon and Jaehaera as they were carried in an open litter up to the Red Keep, where the prince was crowned with a circlet of yellow gold, simple and unadorned, and proclaimed Aegon of House Targaryen, the third of his name, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, and Lord of the Seven Kingdoms. Aegon himself placed the crown upon the head of his child bride. Though a solemn boy, the new king was undeniably handsome, lean of face and form, with silver white hair and purple eyes, whilst the queen was a beautiful child. Their wedding was as lavish a spectacle as the Seven Kingdoms had seen since the coronation of Aegon II in the dragon pit. All that was lacking were dragons. There would be no triumphal flight around the city walls for this king, no majestic descent upon the castle yard. And the more observant made note of another absence. The Dowager Queen was nowhere to be seen, though as Jaehaera's grandmother, Alicent Hightower ought to have been present. As he was still but 10 years of age, the new king's first act was to name the men who would protect and defend him, and rule for him until he came of age. Sir Willis Fell, the sole survivor of the Kingsguard of King Viserys's time, was made Lord Commander of the White Swords, with Sir Marston Waters as his second. As both men were considered greens, the remaining places in the Kingsguard were filled with blacks. Sir Tywin Lannister, recently returned from MYR, was made Hand of the King, whilst Lord Leowen Corbray was Nemed Protector of the realm. The former had been a green, the latter a black. Over them would sit a council of regency, consisting of Lady Jane Eyre of the Vale, Lord Corlys Valerion of Driftmark, Lord Roland Westerling of the Crag, Lord Royce Caron of Nightsong, Lord Manfred Muden of Maidenpool, Sir Torrin Manderley of White Harbour, and Grand Maester Munkin, newly chosen by the Citadel to take up Grand Maester Orwyle's chain of office. It is reliably reported that Lord Cregan Stark was also offered a place amongst the regents, but refused. Conspicuous omissions from the council included Kermit Tully, Onwyn Peake, Sabitha Frey, Thaddeus Rowan, Lionel Hightower, Johanna Lannister, and Benjicott Blackwood, but Septon Eustace insists that only Lord Peake was truly angered by his exclusion. This was a council of which Septon Eustace heartily approved, 6 strong men and 1 wise woman, 7 to rule us here on earth as the 7 above rule all men from their heaven. Mushroom was less impressed. 7 regents were 6 too many, he said. Pity our poor king. Despite the fool's misgivings, most observers seemed to feel that the reign of King Aegon III had begun on a hopeful note. The remainder of the year 131 AC was a time of departures, as the great lords of Westeros took their leaves of King's Landing one by one to return to their own seats of power. Amongst the first to flee were the 3 widows, after bidding tearful farewells to the daughters, son, siblings, and cousins who would remain to serve the new king and queen as companions and hostages. Cregan Stark led his much diminished host north along the Kingsroad within a fortnight of the coronation. 3 days later, Lord Blackwood and Lady Alysanne set out for Raventry, with 1,000 of Stark's northerners as a tail. Lord Lionel and his paramour, the Lady Sam, rode south for Alltown with their Hightowers, whilst Lords Rowan, Beesbury, Costain, Tarley, and Redwyn joined to escort His High Holiness to the same destination. Lord Kermit Tully and his knights returned to Riverrun, whilst his brother Sir Oscar set sail with his stormbreakers for Tyrosh and the disputed lands. There was one who did not depart as planned, however. Sir Medric Minderly had agreed to take the men bound for the wall as far as White Harbour on his galley North Star. From there they were to proceed overland to Castle Black. On the morning the North Star was to sail, however, account of the condemned revealed a man was missing. Grand Maester Orwyle, it seemed, had experienced a change of heart as regarded taking the Black. Bribing one of his guards to loose his fetters, he had changed into a beggar's rags and disappeared into the stews of the city. Unwilling to linger any longer, Sir Medric sentenced the guard who had freed Orwyle to take his place, and the North Star sought the sea. By the end of 131 AC, Septon Eustace tells us, a grey calm had settled over King's Landing in the Crownlands. Aegon III sat the Iron Throne when required, but elsewise was little seen. The task of defending the realm fell to the Lord Protector, Leowen Corbray, the day-to-day tedium of rule to the blind hand, Tywin Lannister. Once as tall and golden-haired and dashing as his twin, the late Lord Jason, Sir Tyland had been left so disfigured by the Queen's torturers that ladies new to court had been known to faint at the sight of him. To spare them, the Hand took to wearing a silken hood over his head on formal occasions. This was perhaps a misjudgment, for it gave Sir Tyland a sinister aspect, and before very long the small folk of King's Landing began to whisper tales of the malign masked sorcerer in the Red Keep. Sir Tyland's wits remained sharp, however. He might have been expected to have emerged from his torments a bitter man intent upon revenge, but this proved far from true. Instead, the Hand claimed a curious failure of memory, insisting that he could not recall who had been black and who green, whilst demonstrating a dogged loyalty to the son of the very queen who had sent him to the torturers. Very quickly Sir Tyland achieved an unspoken dominance over Leo Corbray, of whom Mushroom says, "He was thick of neck and thick of wit, but never have I known a man to fart so loudly." By law, both the Hand and the Lord Protector were subject to the authority of the Council of Regents, but as the days passed and the moon turned and turned again, the Regents convened less and less often, whilst the tireless, blind, hooded Tyland Lannister gathered more and more power to himself. The challenges he faced were daunting, for winter had descended upon Westeros and would endure for 4 long years, a winter as cold and bleak as any in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. The kingdom's trade had collapsed during the dance as well. Countless villages, towns, and castles had been slighted or destroyed, and bands of outlaws and broken men haunted the roads and woods. A more immediate problem was posed by the Dowager Queen, who refused to reconcile herself to the new king. The murder of the last of her sons had turned Alicent's heart into a stone. None of the regents wished to see her put to death, some from compassion, others for fear that such an execution might rekindle the flames of war. Yet she could not be allowed to take part in the life of the court as before. She was too apt to rain down curses on the king, or snatch a dagger from some unwary guardsman. Alicent could not even be trusted in the company of the little queen. When last allowed to share a meal with her grace, she had told Jaehaera to cut her husband's throat whilst he was sleeping, which set the child to screaming. Sir Tyland felt he had no choice but to confine the Queen Dowager to her own apartments in Maegor's Holdfast, a gentle imprisonment, but imprisonment nonetheless. The Hand then set out to restore the kingdom's trade and begin the process of rebuilding. Great lords and smallfolk alike were pleased when he abolished the taxes enacted by Queen Rhaenyra and Lord Celtigar. With the crown's gold once more secure, Sir Tyland set aside 1,000,000 golden dragons as loans for lords whose holdings had been destroyed during the dance. Though many availed themselves of this coin, the loans did bring about a rift between the Iron Throne and the Iron Bank of Bravos. He also ordered the construction of 3 huge fortified granaries, in King's Landing, Lannisport, and Gulltown, and the purchase of sufficient grain to fill them. The latter decree drove up the price of grain sharply, which pleased those towns and lords with wheat and corn and barley to sell, but angered the proprietors of inns and pot shops, and the poor and hungry in general. Though he called a halt to work on the gargantuan statues of Prince Aemond and Prince Daeron that had been commissioned by Aegon II, not before the heads of the 2 princes had been carved, the Hand set hundreds of stonemasons, carpenters, and builders to work on the repair and restoration of the dragon pit. The gates of King's Landing were strengthened at his command, so they might better be able to resist attacks from within the city walls as well as without. The Hand also announced the crown's funding for the construction of 50 new war galleys. When questioned, he told the regents that this was meant to provide work for the shipyards and defend the city from the fleets of the Triarchy. But many suspected Sir Tyland's real purpose was to lessen the crown's dependence on House Valerion of Driftmark. The Hand might also have been mindful of the continuing war in the west when he set the shipwrights to work. Whilst the ascent of Aegon III did mark an end to the worst of the carnage of the Dance of the Dragons, it is not wholly correct to assert that the young king's coronation brought peace to the 7 kingdoms. Fighting continued in the west through the first 3 years of the boy king's reign, as Lady Johanna of Castle Rock continued to resist the depredations of Dalton Greyjoy's Ironborn in the name of her son, young Lord Lauren. The details of their war lie outside our purpose here. For those who would know more, the relevant chapters of Archmaester Mancaster's Sea Demons, A History of the Children of the Drowned God of the Isles are especially good. Suffice it to say that whilst the Red Kraken had proved a valuable ally to the Blacks during the dance, the coming of peace demonstrated that the Ironmen had no more regard for them than for the Greens. Though he stopped short of openly declaring himself King of the Iron Isles, Dalton Greyjoy paid little heed to any of the edicts coming from the Iron Throne during these years, mayhaps because the king was a boy, and his Hand a Lannister. When commanded to cease his raiding, Greyjoy continued as before. Told to restore the women his Ironmen had carried off, He replied that, only the drowned god may sunder the bond between a man and his salt wives. Instructed to return Fair Isle to its former lords, he replied, should they come rising back up from beneath the sea, we shall gladly give them back what once was theirs. When Johanna Lannister attempted to build a new fleet of warships to take the battle to the Ironmen, the Red Kraken descended on her shipyards and put them to the torch, and made off with another 100 women in the nonce. The Hand sent an angry reproach, to which Lord Dalton replied, the women of the West prefer men of iron to cowardly lions, it would seem, for they jump into the sea and plead with us to take them. Across Westeros, the winds of war were blowing up the narrow sea as well. The murder of Sheriko Lohar of Lee, the admiral who had presided over the Triarchies disaster in the Gullet, proved to be the spark that engulfed the three daughters in flames, fanning the smoldering rivalries of Tyrosh, Lee, and Myr into open war. It is now commonly accepted that Sheriko's death was a personal matter. The arrogant admiral was slain by one of his rivals for the favor of a courtesan known as the Black Swan. At the time, however, his death was seen as a political killing, and the Myrish were suspected. When Lee and Myr went to war, Tyrosh seized the opportunity to assert its dominion over the Stepstones. To press that claim, the Archon of Tyrosh called up Raclio Rindun, the flamboyant captain general who had once commanded the Triarchies forces against Daemon Targaryen. Raclio overran the islands in a trice and put the reigning king of the Narrow Sea to death, only to decide to claim his crown for himself, betraying the Archon and his native city. The confused four-sided war that followed had the effect of closing the southern end of the Narrow Sea to trade, cutting off King's Landing, Duskendale, Maidenpool, and Gulltown from commerce with the east. Pentos, Bravos, and Lorith were similarly affected, and sent envoys to King's Landing in hopes of bringing the Iron Throne into a grand alliance against Raclio and the quarrelsome daughters. Sir Tyland entertained them lavishly, but refused their offer. It would be a grave mistake for Westeros to become embroiled in the endless quarrels of the free cities, he told the Council of Regents. That fateful year 131 AC came to a close with the seas aflame both east and west of the Seven Kingdoms and blizzards descending on Winterfell in the north. Nor was the mood in King's Landing a happy one. The small folk of the city had already begun to grow disenchanted with their boy king and little queen, neither of whom had been seen since the wedding, and whispers about the hooded hand were spreading. Though the reborn shepherd had been taken by the gold cloaks and relieved of his tongue, others had risen in his place to preach of how the king's hand practiced the forbidden arts, drank baby's blood, and was besides a monster who hides his twisted face from gods and men. Within the walls of the Red Keep, there were whispers about the king and queen as well. The royal marriage was troubled from the first. Both bride and groom were children. Aegon III was now 11, Jaehaera only 8. Once wed, they had very little contact with one another save on formal occasions, and even that was rare, as the little queen was loath to leave her chambers. Both of them are broken, Grand Maester Munkin declared in a letter to the conclave. The girl had witnessed the murder of her twin brother at the hands of Blood and Cheese. The king had lost all 4 of his own brothers, then watched his uncle feed his mother to a dragon. These are not normal children, Munkin wrote. They have no joy in them, they neither laugh nor play. The girl wets her bed at night and weeps inconsolably when she is corrected. Her own ladies say that she is 8, going on 4. Had I not laced her milk with sweet sleep before the wedding, I am convinced the child would have collapsed during the ceremony. As for the king, the new Grand Maester went on, Aegon shows little interest in his wife, or any other girl. He does not ride or hunt or joust, but neither does he enjoy sedentary pursuits such as reading, dancing, or singing. Though his wits seem sound enough, he never initiates a conversation, and when spoken to his answers are so curt one would think the very act of talking was painful to him. He has no friends save for the bastard boy Geemon Palehair, and seldom sleeps through the night. During the hour of the wolf he can oft be found standing by a window, gazing up at the stars, but when I presented him with Archmaester Lyman's Kingdoms of the Sky, he showed no interest. Aegon seldom smiles and never laughs, but neither does he display any outward signs of anger or fear, save in regards to dragons, the very mention of which sends him into a rare rage. Orwyle was wont to call his grace calm and self-possessed. I say the boy is dead inside. He walks the halls of the Red Keep like a ghost. Brothers, I must be frank. I fear for our king, and for the kingdom. His fears, alas, would prove to be well-founded. As bad as 131 AC had been, the next 2 years would be much worse.